Okay, hi everyone. So welcome to week 8. This week we'll be covering technologies of exhibition and the political economy of culture. Principally trying to understand this through the recent terminology that's used to talk about how artists or various types of creative practitioners come together as a group. Very often the term that is used today is called the creative hubs, and understanding the creative hubs in relation to the discourse of the political economy is where we're hoping to unpack some of the assumptions that it makes about what creativity means in today's context. And we will also then explore other ways in which we can frame and understand creativity outside of the language of policymakers. Okay, so to start off with, maybe uh, uh, I like to sort of like direct your attention to what you are seeing on the screen here. It's an image dated back to 1851, and it records what was called the Great Exhibition that was held in London. So, very interestingly, for this big exhibition, a specially designed building was created using principally glass and steel. So you can see here, uh, it, it was sort of like meant to, it was designed so that it can, it has minimal sort of like obstruction in terms of like the various sort of like support structure, so that you get a big hall for you to put things in, and for you to sort of like see everything inside the hall itself. So this is a building that was also introducing a new way in which you can experience space, right? And as a format of exhibition, what's interesting that it was trying to do, what it was trying to do was that it was trying to miniaturize the world into a hall. So what you get in the exhibition was a showcase of things, of objects, of artifacts from all over the world. That especially in territories and dominions that belong to the British Empire. So if you look at the Victoria and Albert Museum inventory, online inventory today, you're still able to find, for example, artifacts that were sent from the Strait Settlement uh, to the exhibition, and assuming that the objects themselves were actually exhibited in this particular exhibition. So, it, coming back to the exhibition, what we can see here is that there's a new and novel system of display uh, that is not just condensing information about the present day, but it is also using the exhibition as a format to enable you to experience and immerse yourself in that space. So one of the most interesting thing about these types of World Expo is that increasingly over time, and if you look back and study various kinds of like souvenir programs that were published over the years, uh, this format of exhibition increasingly became more and more immersive. So the exhibition doesn't only then sort of showcase objects from all over the world uh, made in the present day, but there were also segments that were dedicated to reconstructing historical tableaus, creating like old London streetscapes, so that uh, so that visitors are able to experience what old London used to look like before the Great Fire uh, destroyed the old city sort of like scape. Uh, so in a way, this type of viewing experience is really not that different from something that all of us are probably very familiar with before the pandemic. That is the mall culture. Uh, so what I want to sort of like emphasize here is that when you look at something like the Great Exhibition, or think of like what your everyday malling experience is like, we can see how this kind of like exhibition form of display, of spectacle, of causing you delight can function really as a kind of technology. And what I mean here is that there is a science behind the production of how to communicate information about something to the audience. And this is achieved principally through the idea of either assembling together, classifying, and displaying artifacts to serve as object lessons, so that the motivating or the thing that communicates information to you is the fact that the artifact is there. So the artifact serves to sort of like transmit and share, impart an idea or knowledge to you, or another, or similar to that vein is that the space of the exhibition is also sort of like used in order to create a time rhythm, so that as you walk through the space, you also get a sense of the idea in the form of a narrative. Uh, so in many ways, when we think of exhibition in this light, then we can think of it as a medium that has very unique kind of properties, which can be experimented with, which can be tested, which can also be limiting on some level. Uh, so in this sense, I think when we want to sort of like talk about exhibition or exhibition sort of like history, we need to then be aware of what are the possibilities, or what are the and the limitations that is connected to this particular medium, and thinking about what it offers and what it does not offer is important, because if you want to work in curating, you got to know what you can sort of like achieve by staging an exhibition, as opposed to writing a book on a specific topic, as opposed to building an archive, uh, or, 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 or creating a series of public programs, because the exhibition does communicate information, but in a certain way. Uh, so being aware of that does sort of like help. Uh, but in many cases, when we talk about how exhibitions subsequently develop, it very often takes after a few conventions that we are today quite familiar with. So typically, there is a solo exhibition where the main where the exhibition showcases works primarily from one artist, and the artist is on that occasion showing a new body of work. And then there is this thing called the survey, where you're looking at a range of artifacts or objects, perhaps by different makers, covering a longer period of time belonging to a particular time period or an era, or a particular theme, that is then sort of like brought together for consideration, for reflection and study. And this is normally called a survey. And there is also this thing called the retrospective, which looks specifically and critically at the work of a particular artist. And normally the artist tends to be a bit more senior, with a lot of accomplishments and achievements already in his artistic career. And the retrospective is a way of looking back and reflecting on his career as an artist, what he has done. Okay, so when it comes to the artistic field, these are some of the exhibition types that you normally encounter. Typically, these types of exhibitions are accompanied by a catalog. So the gallery or the organizing body or the museum would publish a catalog, and in the catalog, invited writers will be asked to comment on the work of the artist or the theme of the exhibition. So it's think of it in terms of how this commentary as a way to invite different types of interpretation, or so that you're able to sort of like appreciate the artist's work from different and multiple perspectives. Yeah, but you know, this type of exhibition then feeds into a larger kind of industry, and it has huge sort of like economic stake in today's sort of like today's world. So when you look at an art fair like Art Basel Hong Kong, it's one of the biggest art fair in the world. It brings together some of the most prominent galleries from all over the world, and they come to Hong Kong once a year, where they showcase their artists. Alongside the gallery showcase, the organizers of Art Basel will also commission specific artists to realize showpiece projects, and these are sometimes for sale, other times are more challenging for someone who wants to collect and keep artworks in their home to actually buy those works. But nevertheless, art fairs like this has cultivated a huge clientele pool that very often are willing to spend money on artworks that have very that actually uses very challenging mediums when it comes to thinking about how you want to conserve the artwork. So when we think of Art Basel in this way, we see in the image down here a multiplication of all these mini solos, surveys, and retrospective in little booths. And in some ways, it is also, I cannot help but connect it to this idea of the Great Exhibition. It almost as if it fulfills a 19th century sort of like longing in the 21st century sort of like context. When we see exhibitions, art fairs exhibition like this, it's done in a scale that is also about the spectacle value of the work. It's meant to be impressive. It's meant to sort of like shock. It's also meant to sort of like create a sense of awe in the visitor, right? So thinking of sort of like art this way is interesting, because then we get to also see, as much as we think of the exhibition as a format that that allows for great sort of like creative application of storytelling skill. It actually turns out that it's also a very limiting kind of like medium, right? And principally because a lot of us still primarily today associate the exhibition with one particular convention of thinking about space, and that is the white cube. So typically, this is what we have in our mind when we think of a museum, when we think of a gallery space, and we see a white box with little ornamental or design or colorful interference on the wall, save for the art object itself. And in this sort of like empty room, one comes into close contact with the work, and it's meant to sort of like, the room is meant to design a kind of experience where you can be on a one-to-one kind of relationship and conversation with the work of art. So the assumption is, for the longest time, The white room creates a kind of neutral space for the experiencing of artworks as autonomous aesthetic objects. Of course, this has come under criticism, and in fact, scholars have argued the white cube itself is pretty much just as ideologically driven and not as neutral as advocates claim, because it supports a particular kind of like experiencing of art. It supports a particular kind of like isolating of an artwork from other types of contexts, so that it produces a very specific sort of like way in which you're supposed to interact or understand the work of art. But of course, that's only one way in which we can understand or appreciate artwork. Art exists in many different sort of like contexts. Traditionally, in other cultures, for example, art is very often defined also by its use value. So if you want to think of a gallery space, it really sort of like cuts away those other possible functions of art in order to regulate and define the experience of art through a very narrow convention of how it understands aesthetic experience to be. What else is there out there then? Then if we want to move or think outside of the white cube, there are other history of exhibitions, even stemming from the history of modern art that we can draw on and think about. So for example, there's the Surrealist exhibition from 1939, you see on the left here, where all the Surrealist artists occupied rented an apartment, and in the apartment itself started filling out the ceiling with coal sacks, arranging pictures or paintings in sort of like neatly sort of like stacked rows, as well as intervening and throwing and situating a lot of like objects that obstructs the easy passage. So what you get a sense, even by viewing or looking at this image, is that it appears as if you're entering inside a cave. And this is further enhanced by the fact that there was very minimal lighting, and all visitors to the exhibition were given a torchlight, so that you're supposed to sort of like use a torchlight to shine on the works in order to discover what's inside in a very progressive fashion. You don't get to see everything at once. And it creates a sense of sort of like mystery because it's all couched in sort of like darkness. This kind of experience was also something that was explored by modern artists, not just the white cube kind of format. And on the right here, then you're also seeing the Presa exhibition by of a pavilion created by the Soviet Union, and where you see photographs from newspapers being sort of like used to create a very impressive monumental sort of like design of how information flows, right? Look at how sort of like dynamic the structure is with all its vertical, all its sort of like diagonal angles, shooting up to the ceiling, alongside all these sort of like sharp geometric sort of like features that might suggest some kind of dynamic sort of like energy or motion that is in play. And that's how news or photographic sort of like print was perhaps thought to have to embody, right? So if we think of in today's context, how a digital image travel through all parts of the world in manners that you cannot even sort of like predict or foresee. That kind of energy is what the installation artist for this pavilion was trying to sort of possibly convey by designing the pavilion using very bold, strong vertical, dynamic sort of like intersecting lines that suggest motion, mobility, and dynamism. Okay, so these are examples that we can sort of like draw from history in order to perhaps also decenter what white cube, the white cube as the primary sort of like viewing experience. When the white cube sort of like became the dominant viewing experience, it came about principally because of the ascendancy of American modern art, especially with abstract expressionism, wanting to have the way it is framed is that because abstract expressionists sort of like values individual sort of liberty and freedom, and therefore uh, the work itself needed to have a distinct uh, autonomous identity uh, that is removed from context. And we should sort of like engage and appreciate the works uh, uh, on its own. And therefore, you need to create the kind of environment uh, to allow for that understanding of the work to take place. And that was why the white cube slowly grew and became more and more sort of like prominent. And you often find it is also more suited to very specific sort of like art forms. Uh, so eh, recently, however, I think there are, so I've already sort of like talked about historical examples where uh, the exhibition itself takes on very sort of like creative form. Uh, and I think a lot of those types of immersive installation based kind of like designing of the exhibition space continues to sort of like take place, especially from the 70s onwards, with the gradual rise of installation art as well. Uh, but I think when it comes to perhaps new ways in which we can think of the exhibition, uh, it's not so much about trying to design immersive spaces that is most radical, because we find this already being experimented all the way back in the early 20th century. I think perhaps some of the most more interesting sort of like ways of thinking about what you can do to push our understanding of the exhibition further can be seen in this example that we have here on the screen. It's called the prep room, and it's a space that is reserved, located within the National University of Singapore's art museum. Okay, so the NUS museum, if you've been there, has 3 levels. And in one small corner of the museum, normally they reserve this space that is called the prep room. So as the title itself suggests, it stands for a preparatory room, but it functions as a very interesting kind of in-between space. Uh, Occasionally, it can serve as an exhibition space for ideas that are still germinating, meaning that even if it's something that the museum curatorial team is still working on, sometimes they take it out and display in the prep room, uh, especially when they reach a phase where they need to work interdisciplinary and in conversation with other academics in the university uh, in order to find different ways to engage the topic. Uh, so the prep room in that sense then allows for a lot of interdisciplinary conversation to happen. Uh, the prep room is also used to foster curatorial training, especially for younger curators and interns, and very often they come from different kinds of disciplines and backgrounds, literature, theater, geography, mathematics. So this in itself, the space in itself then facilitates a very interesting kind of like interdisciplinary conversation that allows students to draw on things that they're studying and how it can sort of like feed and benefit our understanding of artifacts and collections belonging to a museum. Uh, so it's a very interesting kind of like active space that is public and focusing specifically on process rather than thinking of the exhibition as a finished and complete form that is static, that is meant to be presented after the process is done. So the process is then sort of like weaved into all the exhibitions that were subsequently staged at this museum. And the platform is that facilitating point that allows you to see how ideas manifest themselves into concrete exhibitions. Okay? Uh, Another type of sort of like area which we can think of is basically different types of art projects that are often called social practices or community engagement practices or community projects. So the different terms that you can use to sort of like frame this, but principally, I think the scale is also very different for different artists and different collectives and organizations, depending on their resources and depending on their politics as well. So you could, for example, work very intently with a very specific community and very small community for a very long period of time. And that in itself is a type of social practice that is centered on committing oneself to a particular relationship that you want to build with a community. Other types of social practices tend to take the form of like parachuting in and out of different communities, introducing, I guess, creating opportunities for sort of like conversation and for wider public social society sort of like acknowledgement of the community sort of like cultural state within that society. So the artwork itself serves as a sort of like interface where certain knowledge about the community is then communicated through the artistic collaboration with the wider public. Okay, but there are also social practices like what you see here on the screen that focuses on various forms of creative infrastructure building. And this takes on scales that at times it's also hard for us to sort of like comprehend if we continue to sort of hold on to the idea of artists as working as someone who works individually, who works very privately, and whose artwork is very personal. This is all about social networks and net worth. What you're seeing here is a typical kind of like hipster-looking event by a Jakarta collective called Ruang Rupa. They've been around since 1998, right after the Indonesian Reformation that ousted the former president, dictatorial president Sukarno, and ushered in a period of great optimism for Indonesian society to rethink, what is the public and how public engagement can work. And Ruang Rupa was at the heart of trying to think of how you can enact creativity and design creative and foster creativity in a city as chaotic as Jakarta. Of course, over the years, they've done very well from themselves. They started off running a small little artisan space, and then it branched out into running annual art student exhibition for the art schools of Jakarta. They subsequently curated biennales, they run radio programs, they run screening programs. They do everything. They run research platforms. They publish journals. Today, of course, their largest achievement is running this multi-arm kind of like platform called Good School in Jakarta, where it functions almost as a decentralized system or uh, a decentralized kind of like learning platform for young artists who want to learn about creativity through practice rather than just going through art school. So it's a mixture of, uh, of different initiatives centered on different kinds of like projects. Some can be on focusing on film criticism. Others can sort of like focus on community engagement types of like creative projects, running community sort of like engagement projects. Others then focus on sort of like developing a public radio channel. Others then sort of like look at new media forms of technology and hacking possibilities. So there are all these sort of like different initiatives that are then clustered around a warehouse that they've secured. And this model then sort of like allows for a creative community to slowly sort of like come together. So I point this out only because it's Rangrupa is a very sort of like significant name now, and I think just this year they were named by Art Review sort of like Power 100, the top 100 sort of like power people in the art world ranking list, coming at number 3. And that's very significant because in previous years, I don't think any Southeast Asian has climbed so high up in the ranking ladder, principally because they are also appointed as the curators or the artistic director for the upcoming Documenta festival, which is a type of Biennale, but this festival in Germany actually takes place every 5 years rather than every 2 years. So Documenta is significantly seen as this important survey of new contemporary art and new ways of thinking about sort of like contemporary art. And they have been sort of like chosen to curate that exhibition. So when you think of an artist collective having so many sort of like projects and so many kinds of like commitments in so many different types of spaces, it's very different from how we normally think of the lone moping, remove, and perhaps a little bit alienated kind of like artist painter, right? But this is also to sort of like suggest to you that our idea of what art is has shifted sort of so much so that very often when we think about art, especially with the example that I've showed you about the art fair, we don't think of art on only aesthetic terms. We also think of it in terms of its connection to the economy. And therefore, we think of it under what a lot of like people today have called the creative economy. In a sense, it is the creative economy is part of a way of approach in which we want to think of creativity as having been industrialized. So it supports the industrialization of creativity. And when it comes to sort of like industrialization, it means that it can be sort of like packaged, it can be made professional, it can be made predictable, and therefore it can also be quantifiable. You can produce data that suggests that creativity is contributing actual value to society. So a lot of the creative economy sort of like discourse and conversation is centered around this. And creative hubs then becomes a new kind of like buzzword uh, to describe communities uh, that supports uh, this idea of creative community, that contributes to creative community. So what are some of the hubs that we are talking about? I think a good example when we look at, Malaysia is uh, uh, this adaptive reuse of an old printing factory uh, belonging to a family, and so the younger owner managed to convince the older family members to convert the factory into a kind of like creative playground where it houses a co-working space, meaning that these are open platform offices where people can rent specific seats uh, and work together and share in the hope that working in a sort of like open plan sort of like office, different people with different businesses are also able to sort of like exchange and share ideas that might lead to interesting kind of creative collaboration. It also has an exhibition space down there. It has a lot of different cafes, and it runs a lot of different sort of like public events that attract young people. So creative hubs then tend to sort of like take on this kind of like uh, understanding of culture that tries to sort of like package or package culture as something that is cool, that you can sort of like belong to, and creativity as something that 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 enhances lifestyle, right? Uh, and for the longest time, I think when we think of the creative economy and creative hubs solely through this lens and using this as the main normative sort of like convention in which we can think of what the potential of creative hubs is, I think then it really limits how we understand uh, what creativity means, perhaps in different parts of the world and in other sort of like cultural contexts. And this would then perhaps also severely limit our understanding of maybe terms like collectivity or collaboration in forms of creative undertaking. So why do people collaborate, or why do people work together, or why do people even try to be sort of like creative? uh, is something that very often systems like this, as beautiful as they sound in terms of how it fosters uh, a friendly sort of like atmosphere for young people to sort of express themselves. It creates a platform that creates more opportunities for collaboration and creativity to sort of like emerge. All these things are, I think, are claims that needs to be critically sort of like unpacked. Because when you say something like this, does it mean that only by sort of like designing spaces like this that creativity will flourish? And how does that then actually reflect on our understanding of creativity? Uh, Perhaps another sort of like way to go about it is something that I've learned from a collective called LifePatch. And the person's name is Ucho, who runs LifePatch. And this is an organization that looks at the interesting kind of like possibilities that can emerge out of thinking about art practice in relation to science. Okay? So in Ucho's argument, he he gave a lecture, I think sometime late last year when he came to KL, and in his argument he pointed back to this 19th century painting on the left, and it depicts the exile of a Javanese prince after he has lost the battle with the Dutch. And this sort of like spells the beginning of the colonization of Java by the Netherlands, by the Dutch sort of like colonial forces, right? So there are two sort of like representation of this defeat. The first is the one on the right, where painted by a Dutchman himself. And it really sort of like in commonplace sort of like reading is that, you know, the prince is then sort of like sent to exile, and there is an air of sort of like resignation about him being sort of like exiled, with everyone sort of like wailing in tears and stuff like that. And then there is a Javanese painter who also painted that same historical incident slightly later, where you get a sense that his representation of the prince is markedly more defiant. And this can be sort of like, this is suggested if you look at the figure in comparative terms, right? So here you see his head is sort of like tilted slightly up, and he's sort of like staring above the general, the Dutch general here, which is also given a more caricatured or comic sort of like depiction with a large head and a rather proportionally smaller body. In this way, what Ochoa was suggesting is that Raden Saleh could be thought of as someone who has hacked this original picture and introducing sort of like elements in order to sort of inject a different kind of like perspective into looking at history. So hacking, according to Ochoa, can be traced back to 19th century sort of like beginnings of Indonesian art history. Now, this is a very sort of like gimmicky way of thinking about this painting, and but I find it very sort of like humorous, and it actually sort of like helps Ochoa to explain what he means by hacking in the Indonesian context. And the word that he introduced was called ngoprek. And for Ochoa, ngoprek is a kind of innovation or an improvisation with the things that you have at your disposal when something is broken down. So trying to sort of like historicize the terminology of ngoprek and giving it an art historical dimension, I think it's a very sort of like creative way in saying that we can think of creativity through very different historical lenses and finding our own kind of like historical understanding of what we know to be creative, rather than relying on, you know, some academics from the West who has defined creativity in so and so terms, is perhaps more productive. So that when you see, you know, the running of, say, a makerspace in Indonesia, it connects this type of makerspace not to the introduction of makerspace as a concept or an idea that came from Europe or came from the US, that's just solely imported to the Indonesian context. Because as much as these young people are influenced by, you know, American television, they're also influenced by Jakartan street life culture. And in Jakarta street life itself, ngoprek is a daily kind of practice. If you live in the third world, or those of you who have lived in conditions that where you don't always get, you know, first world goods, you know, things, living with secondhand objects, things fall apart all the time. And you have all these very very creative types of like repairmen that will find different ways to improvise repair for your object so that it lasts another hour, it lasts another day. It see through it that it's sort of like, you know, it's given a new kind of like life. And that kind of like repair skill actually needs a lot of creativity, because you're working around a system that's already been designed to give it a new kind of like life in a new kind of context. And that way of thinking would perhaps also inform the kind of like energy in maker spaces in Indonesia today. So I think when we try to sort of like frame what creativity is today, what Ucho is suggesting that is that perhaps we can also really think more expansively about where and how we can define creativity, how we can understand where creative impulses sort of come from, and perhaps looking at different terminologies, imagining different kinds of like history in which hacking has taken place could be a very productive way to challenge some of the very restrictive language of how we define creativity in terms of the economy and in terms of a profession and in terms of an industry. All right, thank you.